Bastogne, Belgium, December 22, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. A patch of snow-covered farmland south of the town, near the hamlet of Remoyfoss. 4 German soldiers walk forward under 2 white flags moving slowly along the Arlon road. 2 are officers. One carries a leather briefcase under his arm. They are not attacking. They are delivering a message, and the men who receive it will remember it for the rest of their lives. By this date, the German officers converging on Bastogne had every reason to expect that message to end the fight. 6 days earlier, on December 16, 3 German armies had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, driving deep into thinly held American lines in an operation the Wehrmacht called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The goal was audacious: split the American and British armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west before Soviet forces could crush what remained of the German war machine in the east. For the officers of the 5th Panzer Army, advancing under General Hasso von Manteuffel, the first days of the offensive had gone remarkably well. American units had been overrun, isolated, or forced into headlong retreat. The armored spearhead of General Heinrich von Leutwitz's XLVII Panzer Corps, built around the Panzer Lehr Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, was driving hard toward a small Belgian crossroads town that appeared, on every map in every German headquarters, as the single most important terrain feature in the entire southern sector of the attack. That town was Bastogne. 7 paved roads and a railway line converged there, threading through the wooded highlands of the Ardennes like spokes on a wheel. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the ability to move armor, fuel, and supplies west toward the Meuse River. Whoever did not hold it would be forced to detour their columns through narrow secondary roads unsuited to heavy vehicles, bleeding away the speed on which the entire German plan depended. German commanders understood this with total clarity. So did the American High Command, which rushed the 101st Airborne Division, at that moment resting and refitting near Reims, France, after the costly airborne operations in the Netherlands, into trucks and sent them racing through the night toward Bastogne, arriving in the town on December 19, mere hours ahead of the German advance guard. What followed over the next several days produced a series of documented reactions from German officers that reveal, in their own recorded words, how badly this small American garrison disrupted their calculations. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, had already voiced doubts about Bastogne before the offensive even began. At a planning conference at the German High Command's western headquarters at Ziegenberg on December 12, Bayerlein was directly asked whether he could seize Bastogne. According to his own post-war account, he replied that the town could only be captured by surprise, and that otherwise it would require a heavily prepared assault. That warning proved prophetic. On the night of December 18 into 19, Bayerlein's lead reconnaissance elements reached the village of Majoret, roughly 3 miles east of Bastogne. There, a Belgian civilian told him that an American armored column of 50 tanks, 25 self-propelled guns, and a general officer had passed through only hours earlier. No such force existed. But Bayerlein believed it, halted his advance to establish a defensive position rather than press forward in the dark, and waited for daylight. That single night of hesitation allowed the lead elements of the 101st Airborne's 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment to reach Bastogne first. When Bayerlein's forces finally attacked the high ground east of the town on the morning of December 19, the engagement lasted only about 3 hours before Bayerlein broke it off, having suffered losses he considered unsustainable given terrain poorly suited to armor. The race for Bastogne, as later historians and Bayerlein's own interrogators would note, had been lost by the Germans by a matter of hours. By December 21, von Leutwitz's corps had completed a ring around Bastogne, sealing off roughly 8 kilometers of American-held ground and trapping approximately 11,000 to 14,000 defenders inside, along with thousands of Belgian civilians. For 2 days, the German command paused to consolidate its encirclement and bring up reinforcements, including heavy artillery. It was during this pause that von Leutwitz made a decision that would produce the most famous German officer quotation to come out of the entire battle, though not in the way he intended. On the morning of December 22, von Leutwitz drafted a formal surrender ultimatum, informing the American commander that Bastogne was completely surrounded, that there's only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation, and demanding an honorable surrender within 2 hours or the town would be destroyed by German artillery. He dispatched 4 soldiers under flags of truce to deliver it: Major Alvin Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps Staff, Lieutenant Helmuth Henk of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men drawn from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The delegation was met by soldiers of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, and specifically by a Browning automatic rifle gunner, Private First Class Leo Palma, who watched the 2 German officers approach in long overcoats and polished black boots, one still carrying the briefcase containing the ultimatum. The Germans were blindfolded and escorted through the lines to a command post, where the message eventually reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne. When McAuliffe read the demand, his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, later recalled McAuliffe's immediate, almost dismissive reaction. According to accounts drawn from division records and later published in Colonel S.L.A. Marshall's official history of the siege, McAuliffe's first words upon grasping that the Germans were demanding his surrender were simply, "A surrender, aw nuts." When his staff searched for a formal way to phrase the reply, Kinnard reportedly told him, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." The written reply that was carried back to the German delegation read in its entirety, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." What happened next is where the documented reactions of the German officers become historically significant, because their confusion and their attempts to make sense of an answer they could not translate were recorded by multiple American witnesses present at the scene, including Colonel Joseph Harper, the officer who delivered the reply, and Private Ernest Primetz, a German-speaking medic who assisted as an informal interpreter. When Harper handed the note to Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henk, the reply was read aloud. Henk, still operating under the assumption that this was the opening move of a formal negotiation, asked directly, "Is that reply negative or affirmative?" He explained that if the response was affirmative, he was authorized to continue discussing surrender terms. Harper answered that the reply was decidedly not affirmative and warned that further attacks would produce tremendous German losses. The German officers, unfamiliar with the American slang term nuts as an expression of contemptuous refusal, remained genuinely puzzled. They asked again what the word meant. Harper, working with Primetz to find language the Germans would understand without ambiguity, ultimately told them plainly, in plain English, "Go to hell." Primetz translated a version of this into German directly, telling the officers, "Du kannst zum Teufel gehen," you can go to the devil. At that point, according to the American accounts, the meaning finally registered. Lieutenant Henk, absorbing the rejection, offered his own reply, a line that stands as one of the most direct German officer statements recorded from the siege: "We will kill many Americans." "This is war," Harper's response, delivered with a kind of grim informality that surprised even himself, was to tell the Germans, "On your way and good luck to you," before catching himself having wished luck to an enemy he intended to keep fighting. The German officers were escorted back to their own lines, retrieved their pistol belts, and made their way through Le Trebois to report first to the headquarters of the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, then onward toward the Panzer Lehr Division command post. Along the route, according to Henk's own post-war written account, Major Wagner paused to remove his pistol from a trouser pocket where he had hidden it under the terms of the flag of truce, and holstered it, remarking that he did not intend to be caught unarmed. It is a small human detail, but a documented one, and it captures something of the mood among the German officers as they absorbed what had just happened, a shift from the formal expectation of negotiation back into the hard reality of continued combat. When the 2 officers reached the Panzer Lehr command post, they found General von Leutwitz himself present. They delivered the American reply, according to the record preserved in the U.S. Army's own official account of the episode. General Bayerlein, upon hearing that the surrender demand had been rejected, responded not with disbelief or hesitation, but with an immediate order to resume the offensive, stating that it was time to bring the heavy artillery positioned behind the ridgeline into action against the town. The reaction of General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army above both Bayerlein and von Leutwitz, adds a further layer to the documented German response. When von Manteuffel learned that von Leutwitz had sent a formal surrender ultimatum to Bastogne at all, he was reportedly outraged, not because the demand had failed, but because he judged that the Corps did not yet possess the artillery concentration or infantry strength necessary to make good on the threat of total annihilation if the Americans refused. In von Manteuffel's assessment, the ultimatum had been premature, issued before the German forces ringing Bastogne were actually prepared to level the town, and its rejection now left German credibility exposed at the very moment the offensive's timetable was already slipping. This tension between German commanders, an aggressive threat issued by von Leutwitz, an immediate order to escalate from Bayerlein, and irritation from von Manteuffel over resources not yet in place, illustrates a command structure that was, by December 22, already under considerably more strain than German planners had anticipated when the offensive began less than a week earlier. The German shelling of Bastogne intensified in the days that followed, and the ground assaults continued, but the town did not fall. What makes this episode historically important is not simply the folklore of the word nuts, but what German officers said and did in direct response to encountering a garrison that refused to behave the way encircled, outnumbered forces were expected to behave. The clearest and most valuable evidence of this comes not from the heat of December 1944, but from after the war, when Allied historians debriefing surrendered German commanders asked them directly what conclusions they had drawn from the fighting at Bastogne. Fritz Bayerlein's post-war interrogation, later published and cited by historians studying the battle, is unusually candid. Bayerlein stated that the first surprise for the German command had been the prompt occupation and the strong, determined defense mounted by the American 101st Airborne Division, a defense the German planning staff had not expected to encounter in a town they believed would fall quickly, if not by surprise then certainly under sustained pressure from multiple panzer divisions. He further noted that German commanders had been struck by the speed with which American armored forces were repositioned east of Bastogne to blunt the German assault, describing this rapid, aggressive countermovement as unanticipated. Bayerlein's second documented surprise, in his own post-war words, was the pace at which General George Patton's Third Army pivoted north to strike the German flank in relief of the town, a maneuver the German command had judged would take considerably longer to organize and execute than it in fact did. By December 21, Bayerlein noted, the roads the German forces needed for their own advance near Moissy and Remicompagny towards St. Hubert could only be used under fire from American tanks and armored cars, a sign of how quickly the tactical balance had shifted against German freedom of movement in the sector. This candid post-war assessment from a German general who had commanded armor on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy carries considerable weight, precisely because it was not propaganda, not morale-boosting rhetoric for German troops, and not a statement crafted for wartime consumption. It was a professional soldier's retrospective analysis, delivered to Allied interrogators after the war had ended, explaining exactly where German expectations at Bastogne had diverged from German reality. The Wehrmacht had entered the Ardennes offensive believing speed and concentrated armor would overwhelm scattered American defenses before they could organize. At Bastogne, they instead encountered a division that arrived just ahead of the German advance guard, dug in immediately, refused an ultimatum that assumed their position was hopeless, and then held that position under continuous artillery fire, sub-zero temperatures, critical shortages of ammunition and medical supplies, and near total isolation from resupply until the weather cleared enough for airdrops to resume on December 23. The human cost behind these officer-level exchanges should not be understated. Letters recovered from German soldiers killed or captured during the siege reveal a starkly different tone from the confident post-war analysis of their commanders. One German soldier, writing home to his wife during the height of the encirclement, described the fighting in language that reflected the brutal optimism of a force that still believed victory was close. He wrote that the snow around Bastogne would turn red with American blood, and that victory had never seemed as close as it did in that moment. That letter, dated during the siege itself rather than after it, stands in sharp contrast to what Bayerlein and other officers would later admit once the outcome of the entire Ardennes offensive was known. It illustrates the gap between the confidence at the front line in the German ranks during the final days of December and the sober reassessment that followed once Bastogne held, once Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the town on December 26, and once the broader German offensive collapsed entirely by late January 1945. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, when a spearhead of the 4th Armored Division under Patton's command punched a corridor through German lines to reconnect the town with the rest of the American front, did not immediately end the fighting in the area. German forces continued to press the perimeter into early January, and von Manteuffel was later compelled to withdraw units from the Bastogne front in stages, including the 9th SS Panzer Division on January 5 and 6, as German High Command redirected resources to shore up collapsing positions elsewhere along the shrinking Bulge. By January 9, Patton was able to launch a coordinated attack against the base of the German salient near Bastogne, catching German forces by surprise and forcing a further withdrawal to avoid encirclement. The town that German planners had once expected to seize within the first 2 or 3 days of the offensive, instead, became the fixed point around which an entire flank of the German attack was ground down. Historians who have since studied the German command decisions at Bastogne point to the successful defense as a critical factor in disrupting the broader Ardennes offensive. The decision by von Leutwitz and von Manteuffel to commit substantial forces to reducing Bastogne, rather than simply bypassing and containing it with a smaller screening force, diverted armor, artillery, and infantry that German planners had originally intended to keep moving west toward the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. Every division diverted to besiege Bastogne was a division not advancing the primary German objective. Every day the town held was a day the overall German timetable slipped further behind schedule, at a point in the war when Germany's fuel reserves, replacement troops, and air support were all critically limited and could not sustain a prolonged campaign of attrition. What German officers said in the direct aftermath of facing the 101st Airborne at Bastogne then tells a story in 2 distinct registers. In the moment, officers like Henk spoke the blunt language of continued war, warning that many Americans would die and that this was simply the nature of the conflict they were engaged in. Commanders like Baerlein, in the heat of the siege, responded to rejection with immediate orders to escalate artillery fire rather than reconsider their assumptions. But in the calm, structured environment of post-war interrogation, once the fog of active combat had lifted and the outcome of the entire campaign was settled, the same commanders offered a far more measured and revealing account. Baerlein's own words describe a German command that had underestimated both the speed and the resolve of the American forces it faced at Bastogne, and that found itself repeatedly forced to react to American initiative rather than dictate the terms of the fight, as the original plan for Wachtum Rhine had assumed it would. The defense of Bastogne did not, by itself, defeat the German Ardennes offensive. The wider battle, fought across a 75-mile front and lasting roughly 41 days from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, involved multiple American armies, thousands of aircraft once the weather cleared, and the full weight of Allied industrial and logistical superiority brought to bear against a German force that had gambled nearly everything it had left in the West on a single, high-risk offensive. But Bastogne became, and remains, one of the clearest single points in that larger battle where the gap between German expectation and German experience can be measured in the actual documented words of the officers who were there, men who expected an honorable surrender within 2 hours, and instead received a single word of refusal they could not even translate, followed by days of a defense that reshaped their understanding of what they were fighting and against whom. That is the value of returning to this history in precise, documented detail. It is not simply the story of a defiant word shouted back at an ultimatum. It is the story of a German command structure, from a lieutenant standing in a snowy field with a translation problem, to a general ordering artillery fire in frustration, to a field marshal's subordinate voicing anger over a threat his forces could not yet back up, to a division commander years later admitting in an interrogation room exactly where his calculations had failed, encountering, in real time and then in retrospect, the stubborn, costly, and ultimately decisive resistance of a surrounded American division that had been told to hold a crossroads town, and did.